Hello and welcome to this quick little video where I'm going to go over the best settings for different types of PvP and PvP in general, and I'll also address this depending on if you're a healer or not. Now, just a heads up that this is just my opinion when it comes to many of these, and if you prefer a different way, then obviously that is fine. I'll also cover ZVZ settings and some additional tips at the end. I will first cover the general settings that you should fix no matter what you're playing, but then go into role specific settings. So, alright, we're just going to go down the list, open up your settings, and look in general. The first thing I highly recommend to do is turn off the camera shake. Then go down and you'll see the vanity settings. Skins are nice and all, but in a PvP situation, being able to see what your opponents are using quickly, before, or as you're inspecting them is important. For that reason, I highly recommend turning off skins for everyone. Same with mount skins. If you're out in a black zone, you want to be quickly able to see whether that guy passing by is on a direwolf or if they're an ox or whatever. And just skins in general are distraction. And I highly recommend turning it for everyone else. For yourself, it's up to you really, but for everyone else, I highly suggest having these only in safe areas, because it truly helps, especially in mid to large scale ZVZs where you can quickly see what enemies are wearing, where you don't have the luxury of inspecting everyone. If you're doing something like perhaps Corrupteds or 2v2 Hellgates, it doesn't matter as much because you're able to inspect people easily. But if you're doing, say, 10v10 Hellgates or 20v20 Crystals or ZVZs, or just big fights in the open world, and you can quickly see, okay, what type of armor is that person wearing, or what weapon is that person wearing. So yeah, I highly suggest having these ones only in safe areas, and for yourself, it's up to you really. I just have my skins on either way because I know what I'm wearing. Obviously, I don't need to look at it. But if the skins for yourself are distracting, then you could also turn that off. For the overcharge settings, I usually overcharge everything, but there are times where you might not want to overcharge a specific piece of equipment. For example, if you're doing 20v20 crystals and you have an enigmatic staff in your inventory, then you might not want to overcharge your main hand and offhand. So you could then turn these off, but this depends what you're playing. You can adjust this easily, it's up to you. Next, we go into video settings. I personally turn everything off or as low as possible. This one will depend on how potato your PC is, but in general, I would still suggest lowering most of these. For example, shadows, not really that useful. Most of these don't matter, but as you go up in scale of content, for example, 10v10 Hellgate, CVZs, there's just so much unnecessary clutter on the screen, and you want to be able to stay focused on the fight itself. And that's the general rule of thumb that I'm going to recommend as you see me going through these settings. The one settings you should enable though is the show effects one, and put it to show all. This is really important. I highly recommend doing this. Yeah, and just turn everything off basically. It's pretty much it. Just make sure you have these ones on all, show effects on all. Audio doesn't really matter, but I will say have sound effects loud enough so you can hear effects going off in combat. It could help you. You can hear certain effects going off. For the interface, I suggest the 80% HUD size. The position of spellbars is honestly just personal preference. I'm just used to having it on the bottom, as basically every game I've played has it on the bottom, so it feels weird to me changing it to having it on the right, but it's up to you. I feel like bottom is just, it's more compact having it there. We scroll down to information, and I suggest turning off the damage numbers in general. Once again, it's cool to see just how much damage you're doing or how much you're healing, but it will just distract you from the action going on and might even make it harder to see certain effects going on. And in mid to large scale fights, it might even end up making you lag. So I highly recommend turning it off. For something like Corrupteds or 2v2s, perhaps it doesn't, even arguably 5v5s, maybe it doesn't matter as much, but I still highly suggest just turning it off. You should know just how much damage and how much healing numbers you're outputting roughly. So this isn't like important at all, to be honest. I will just clutter the screen. So I recommend having it turned off. Numeric spell cooldown timers, I recommend having this on. It's pretty useful. Some people would argue that you should know all your cooldowns without having to look at a number, but it's just a nice thing to have, I think, at least. Let's go down to the spell indication areas. I suggest putting the spell indicator intensity high enough so you can see it without issues. I just have the default value of 90% and that works well. In most situations, I suggest going with the settings I have here, show for enemy damage and show for ally heal. The other two in most situations don't matter and will just clutter fights. Although some people will argue that show for ally damage is useful, especially for small scale. Show for enemy heal might also be perhaps useful, like you see where the enemy is dropping the resets, but just these two is honestly, it's all you need, to be honest. Next, for name tags, it honestly depends on what you're doing. If you're doing something like ganking, then having all the tags is useful. Seeing which guild and alliance you're up against is useful, even if you don't have any naps. As you can see, is that a guild known for always going out with multiple people and fighting sets? Is it some random PvE guild that only does Avas? Is it a ZVZ heavy guild? You know, so it depends. And I think it's useful to have that if you're doing open world and ZVZ stuff. Make sure you always have the show off-screen name tags, really big deal. If you're doing something like Hellgates, on the other hand, though, you could turn off guild names. I recommend having names and health bars turned on because it usually makes communication easier, as you can call targets by name, for example. Which, some people don't do that. Some people call for the weapon, like Focus the Claymore or Focus the Healer, for example. So, you know, for ZVZs, however, unless you're a shot caller or an important member that relays information, you can turn off names, you can turn off guild names for opponents. If you're a healer, you could even turn off health bars for your opponents, as it doesn't really benefit you and will just reduce lag, which is good. This is honestly personal preference and depends how much your PC will lag, especially if we're talking about ZVZs. But the rule of thumb is to turn off as much as you can. That doesn't impact your gameplay, because we want to reduce the clutter and we want to reduce the lag. While we are on the topic of ZVZs, let me quickly just return to video and go up over here to the resolution. I think one really good tip if you're doing ZVZs is, I'm gonna change it real quick to 1280 by 720, and when I change to that, you will see that the quality is obviously very bad. It's horrible, but this thing will actually make your will reduce your lag in ZVZs. It is underrated, and especially if I'm doing very large scale fights like big ZVZs, I usually change to this right when we eat food and pop overcharge. I highly recommend changing to this if your PC can't handle it. Otherwise, obviously, go with the highest resolution. But it is a little underrated tip. If your PC is really bad, change the resolution, lower it like this. It looks horrible. It might hurt your eyes even. Feels like you're taking off your glasses or something. But yeah, it is very useful if you're doing CVCs and you need to reduce the lag. Highly underrated little trick there. Now let's go to controls. Cursor design honestly doesn't matter. I just use the crystal one because I think it's the prettiest. For mouse control scheme, I use classic controls, which I recommend, but you can use which one you prefer. I really like the classic controls one though. And for the spellcasting one, I highly recommend to change from normal spellcast if you're using that one. I would recommend button press or button release depending on what role you're playing. Button press is always good, especially if you're playing something like Frost, Fire, or even some healer roles. I recommend going with button press. While if you're playing something like that has skill shots, for example, you're playing maybe Cursed or Cursed Skull, I recommend going with button release. Honestly, this is personal preference, but if you're playing Frost or Fire, I highly recommend going button press. For other roles, it doesn't really matter if you go press or release. Um, It's up to you which one of these you prefer, but definitely don't go with normal spellcast. Highly recommend doing one of these, the quick casts. Make sure to enable both of these, double press to attack and auto target aggressor, and turn off force combat mode. Next, we'll go to social. I suggest enabling the auto hide chat and turning idle chat background opacity to 0. And adjust the font size to whatever ones you can read chat, obviously. Next, what we'll do is actually, I think, pretty important. We will add an empty tab in our chat box. You can see I already have one here. When I click on it, it's empty. All of these are deselected. And the reason for that is because during certain PvP situations, what I usually do is I click on this empty tab over here. As you can see, I have the empty tab here. If I go into general, I have like stuff going on here, but I'm going to empty tab, and after a few seconds, this chat box will disappear and give me more room over here, less clutter. I highly recommend doing that, especially if you're doing instance content, like say corrupted crystals or hellgates. I usually do this because I don't think I will get any useful information from having chat open. Now, if you're doing open world stuff like ganking or ZVZs or just open world roaming or whatever it is, then having chat open uh, could be beneficial. You could get some useful information, especially if you have someone whispering you or if you have stuff going on in guild chat or alliance chat. So I highly recommend having this empty tab right here and utilizing it, especially when you're doing instance content. And if you go down, we have social. Honestly, just put everything in auto deny and you will not lose out on much. And if you actually need someone to invite your trader, you can just quickly turn it off and then turn it back on. I think it's just you will avoid getting random notifications if someone's trying to troll you, or if you're guildless, then you'll get spammed with guild invites when you're in town. There's also a very important reason for this is if you're not in a party, some people in the black zones will try to invite you just to see if you're alone or not. And the same goes with the trade invites. If I remember correctly, accepting a trade will get rid of your bubble. And this is something people usually do is they try to trade people, especially outside of crafting hideouts, try to open a trade. So, just avoiding the possibility of that happening. I mean, obviously you don't click, you don't accept these, but the party one, and it is could be useful, very niche, obviously, but auto denying everything will not hurt you for the most part, unless you're actually trying to trade someone or actually trying to join a party. Then you could just turn these off and then turn it back on once you're in the party. So it's up to you. Profanity filter, obviously, doesn't matter. Let's go next to key bindings, which is pretty important, especially if you're planning on healing. When healing, especially in something like 20v20 crystals, I suggest setting up the select party members to the following. I have 1 through 10 to 1 through 0 for the numbers, and then 11 to 20 I use my F keys, and this is just so I can reorder the party list when needed, because say I'm trying to heal anywhere from 5 to 10 different people, then what I do is I can put my 5 important people over here, and then say we have people who are rotating, joining in, an extra 5 who are rotating, I can put those to 11 to 15, and then I can also quickly heal them, especially when there's such a fight where there's like 10 people and they're all close by, and I don't want to waste time trying to click on the person. I can quickly use these hotkeys just to heal a specific person who needs the heals, because that split second will matter, and your ally might die just because you took an extra 0.2 seconds longer just to click them in the party list, or just click on them next to when they're next to you. So now for potions and food. For food, I usually actually just click on it with my mouse when it's over there. And for potions, this obviously depends how your keyboard layout is. I have the button on the left of 1, and I use that for potions. Especially if I'm healing, then I just have to have a separate one. But if I'm doing something like corrupteds or tanking, or something I don't need to target allies. I just set this to 1 and 2, which is the default, I think. And then I just go, when I'm healing, and I just go swap back to this. And I think it's really useful to be able to quickly target your teammates, but do make sure you reorder your party list in a way. I always put the tank first, healer second, melee DPS, and then the range DPS. That is usually how I have them ordered, but it's in personal preference how you want to order them. And for the ping, I recommend changing the default for ping is P, I think. I'd recommend changing it to something that's closer where you can quickly press on it without having to reach over with your index finger, because P is like pretty far on the keyboard. I changed it to Z so I can quickly hit it with my pinky finger. But I honestly, it doesn't really matter unless you're doing open world stuff or if you're ganking or stuff. You want to have a very easily accessible ping hotkey. So I recommend changing this to something that you like. Z is just a nice, spot for my pinky finger, I suppose. It's up to you really what you want to pick. The marker stuff is pretty useful, honestly. If you're calling in 20s, you can quickly mark someone by setting hotkeys for this. I personally don't have much use of this, so yeah, it's up to you if you want to change these. Now, next we have the self-casting stuff. I have alt on these. This is important if you have anything that you want to cast on yourself. If you want to self-heal, you just alt Q. Now you can change these to whatever else whatever other button you want. I have alt on all of these, which I think is the default, but you can change it to shift Q, control Q, or whatever else you want. And I think that is it for the most part. We also have the overcharge button, right? But I think this goes into the same category as the food, where usually eat food or you overcharge before you get into a fight. I feel like if you're eating food and overcharging as you're fighting, that means you probably messed up somewhere and should have done that earlier. So you can easily just, click on these right before you get into a fight. I don't feel the need to assign any specific hotkeys to these two. The potion one though is I have I think that's backslash. Once again though, it's personal preference. I just have this hotkey for potions because I need 1 through 0 for healing. And for the notifications, I want to say it doesn't really matter, but you can just set all of these to don't show again. Most of these don't even matter in PvP at all, so it doesn't really matter. Now that's all for the settings, but there are some useful tips that I haven't mentioned that aren't setting specific. One thing I recommend is completely minimizing this thing over here. As you see, you can make it, there you go. It's pretty big, right? And it just clutters the screen. Let me turn it off, turn on the daily bonus as well. This is just cluttering the screen. You can just hide this, drag this like this, and there you go. You have a lot more room on your screen. Highly recommend doing this because this thing honestly doesn't really matter. One thing that's pretty useful is when you're fighting and you have a big party, say you're doing a ZVZ or 20v20 crystals, I highly suggest moving your party list the opposite way of where your opponents are. So if your opponents are coming from the west and your party list is over there and might be like cutting off the edge of your screen, I suggest moving the party list to the right side of your screen, just the opposite of where your opponents are. During a 20v20 or a ZVZ, you might even end up moving your party list several times as you rotate and you change angles. So, just keep that in mind. I remember when I do 20s, I usually change my party list. I move it somewhere else a few times per game. It's not too uncommon, especially if you change angles. I just want to have a better view, of where my opponents are because I can see more and I don't want to reduce my vision by having this like big block of my party members cutting it off. And last thing actually is to type /ping and optionally /fps. That one is up to you. As you can see on the bottom right of my screen, if I type /ping, it toggles my ping, which is useful. And knowing when you're about to lag or if you're lagging, or just to see if you're lagging before you decide, okay, I'm gonna do Hellgates or Corrupteds, might be beneficial for you. I like having it there personally because I can, if I sense lag is coming, I can usually get a good idea of my ping, what's going on. And The FPS honestly is just it's optional. It's up to you if you want to have it there. I like to see it during the ZVZs. I just like seeing my FPS drop to like 5 or 10, you know. Honestly, it's up to you if you want to have these. I like having at least a ping shown over there. And I think that will be it for this video. Hopefully these settings and tips help you out and provide you with some advantages when it comes to PvP situations. If anything, hopefully making your PvP experience better. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments what your favorite settings are, or if you have other suggestions for settings. Subscribe for more Albion online content, and I hope you have a good one.